All right, in this video, we continue on with the Unit 7 Natural Selection, talking about 7.6 Evidence for Evolution. We have talked a little bit about some of this stuff already, how evidence can be found in multiple realms for evolution. For instance, with the Hardy-Weinberg theorem, we talked about how there's just mathematical evidence for evolution. And we're going to look at several other things in this video, talking about geological evidence, talking about fossils. There can be geographical evidence. One of Darwin's findings, for instance, was just seeing that similar kinds of species live in similar types of geography, which is kind of one of his things. There can be physical evidence, looking at the phenotypic evidence of current species and extinct species. There's biochemical evidence, something that has come more on the scene in the last 70 years or so, probably even more like 50 or 40 years, understanding by looking at the biochemical evidence like proteins and DNA, you can also trace evolutionary change. And so let's look at fossil evidence first. Fossils are the preserved remains of organisms. It could be bones, is what we typically think of as fossils, but it could also just be the impression of something. It could be any sort of trace left of them. And there are a couple of ways you can do this. Obviously, like the bones there on the left, you see a bird-like creature that also has some reptile-like tendencies as well, and you can see feathers. And so there's the idea of this kind of transition between birds and reptiles. There, it's called Archaeopteryx, and on the right you have Tiktaalik, which is considered a transitionary species between fish and amphibians, and both of these are found with just straight up digging in the ground, finding the fossil. There's also radiometric dating, where you can look and kind of tell how old a fossil is just by looking at the rate of decay for certain radioactive isotopes. Carbon-14 is very common in living organisms, which carbon-14 works up till around 50,000 years or so, which is perfect for most near fossil sort of things, especially larger creatures. And so, basically the amount of carbon-14 that is left in our cells decays over time and decays back to just standard old carbon-12. And then if there's a certain amount that's left, they can use that and just say, well, this is how old this particular fossil is. And one thing to note about the fossil evidence too, fossil records are sometimes incomplete. In fact, a lot of times they're incomplete, but they still provide information about Earth's history. And a lot of times, I think, particularly with Tiktaalik, what was interesting about the finding of Tiktaalik is uh, science said we should find this species, and then they found it, and it was kind of what they thought it would be. And so it's interesting how our predictions can be matched with actual findings just based on using just straight scientific method. Um, Another example of an evidence is called a morphological homology. A lot of times you'll see these called homologous structures. And a homologous structure is essentially a structure that has the same sort of structural components to it, but may have a different function. What you will see almost all the time with this is the vertebrate forearm. So there on the left, you have our own forearm with the humerus, the upper arm bone, the two forearm bones, and the wrist bones, and then of course the phalanges. And notice cats have the same thing. So do whales and bats, because we're all mammals and we all have similar forearm, even though all four of those have different functions to them. And so this shows common ancestry, shows a link. Another example of this would be vestigial structures. Sometimes, vestigial organs, you'll see either one of those things used. The same sort of idea. A vestigial structure is a structure that is a remnant of a past structure. And so, for instance, why do whales need pelvic bones? They don't have legs. Well, it probably points to the fact that at one time they did. Why do some snakes have leg buds? Why do most snake embryos have leg buds? Well, it shows that they may have come from lizards, which is kind of what the fossil evidence shows. Um, this is different from, I don't have a picture of this, but this is different from analogous structures, which was what you would find with like convergent evolution. If you remember the video with convergent evolution, we talked about the fact that like birds, bats, and butterflies all have wings. Um, they all have a similar function, but they're not the same structure. And so this is the opposite of that. Analogous structures show example of convergent evolution, meaning there's similar kinds of selection pressures acting on different populations, but it doesn't necessarily show a near common ancestry or any common ancestry at all. There's other things that would show common ancestry between birds, bats, and butterflies. Biochemical evidence is next. This is typically one of two things. Biochemical evidence is looking at either proteins or DNA sequencing, and usually, hemoglobin is one that's used for a lot of vertebrates. The hemoglobin amino acids, all vertebrates have hemoglobin because they have blood that carries oxygen, and our blood or our hemoglobin has a particular amino acid sequence, and you would expect us to be closely related to chimps, right? And closely related to gorillas, but not as closely related to them as we are chimps. And you can see that, and then more distantly related to horses and zebras. That's kind of what's going on there. Here shows some the same sort of thing, but just using A's, T's, C's, and G's, nucleotide sequencing. Same kind of idea, but it's just showing that in a different sort of light. And so, again, lots of evidence out there for evolution. The biochemical is where things tend to be now, but the other ones are still definitely in use.